Bloodstains on a marble floor are easy to clean, but family betrayal leaves a permanent mark. Carmine Rousseau handed his heavily overweight outcast daughter over to a ruthless syndicate boss, expecting her to be slaughtered as a cruel joke. He never anticipated she would return to burn his empire down. Penelope Rousseau stood in the suffocating shadows of her father's mahogany-paneled study, her breath coming in shallow, labored rasps. The custom-made silk dress forced upon her by her mother earlier that evening dug mercilessly into her waist. She could feel the seams stretching across her broad shoulders and the heavy rolls of her stomach, the fabric offering no forgiveness. Every shift of her weight caused her thick thighs to chafe painfully against one another. At 24 years old, Penelope a penny, as the maids whispered with pity, weighed nearly 300 pounds. In the glitzy, superficial underworld of the New York syndicates, where mafia daughters were bred to be slender, porcelain trophies traded for alliances, Penny was Carmine Rousseau's greatest shame. The heavy oak doors of the study remained closed, but the muffled, aggressive shouting of men arguing over millions of dollars vibrated through the floorboards. Carmine's syndicate was bleeding money. A botched weapons shipment at the port of Newark had left him $5 million in debt to a man who did not accept apologies, Lorenzo Costa. Penny wiped a bead of sweat from the crease of her double chin, keeping her gaze glued to the Persian rug. She wasn't supposed to be here. Usually, when guests of Lorenzo's caliber arrived, Penny was ordered to stay in the East Wing, hidden out of sight with her accounting ledgers and her boxes of pastries, while her younger, breathtakingly thin sister, Bianca, was paraded around pouring scotch. But tonight Carmine had explicitly ordered his eldest daughter into the study. The shouting abruptly stopped. The doors groaned open, and Arthur, one of Carmine's heavily tattooed lieutenants, grabbed Penny by her fleshy upper arm, his fingers digging into her skin with unnecessary force. "Boss wants you," Arthur grunted, shoving her forward. Penny stumbled, her heavy frame colliding painfully with the doorframe. She caught her balance, her cheeks burning crimson as she entered the room. The air was thick with imported cigar smoke and the metallic tang of impending violence. Her father sat behind his desk, looking ragged and cornered. Standing in the center of the room, flanked by 4 armed men, was Lorenzo Costa. Lorenzo was a terrifying force of nature. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his face looked as though it had been carved from granite. He was 32, ruthless, and had spent the last 5 years systematically absorbing rival territories through calculated bloodshed. His dark eyes were dead, devoid of any warmth or mercy. "You owe me $5 million, Carmine." Lorenzo's voice was a low, resonant grumble that made the hair on Penny's arms stand up. "You don't have the cash. You don't have the territory. So what exactly is the point of this meeting? Because my trigger finger is getting restless." Carmine sneered, a desperate, feral look in his eyes. He stood up and pointed a trembling finger directly at Penny. "I don't have the cash," Carmine agreed, his voice dripping with venom. "But tradition dictates that a debt of honor can be settled with a blood alliance. A marriage. I'm giving you my daughter." Lorenzo's right-hand man, a scarred enforcer named Vincent, let out a harsh, barking laugh. Lorenzo simply turned his head, his cold gaze landing on Penny for the first time. Penny froze. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She knew what this was. This wasn't a marriage proposal. This was an insult. A single father, twist and punish. Carmine was offering Lorenzo the fat pig of the Russo family. It was a calculated slap in the face. Carmine assumed Lorenzo would be so deeply offended by the offering of an obese, unglamorous bride that he would either shoot Penny on the spot in retaliation, or take her away and kill her slowly, thereby legally clearing the debt through her sacrifice without Carmine having to give up his precious Bianca. "This is your offering?" Lorenzo asked, his tone unreadable. He stepped closer to Penny. Penny instinctively shrank back, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Up close, Lorenzo smelled of sandalwood and gunpowder. He looked her up and down, taking in her flushed round face, the way her chest heaved with anxiety, the sheer volume of space she occupied in the room. He saw the sweat on her brow and the trembling of her hands. "She eats more than she speaks," Carmine scoffed from his desk, lighting a fresh cigar. "Take her. Put a ring on her sausage fingers or put a bullet in her massive head. I don't care. She's your problem now. The debt is settled." Tears pricked the corners of Penny's eyes. Even for a man who had called her a whale since she was 12, this was a new low. Her own father was signing her death warrant to save his bank account. Vincent stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered gun. "Boss, this is a joke. Let me put a hollow point in Carmine's skull right now. He's insulting you." Lorenzo raised a single hand, silencing his enforcer instantly. He didn't look away from Penny. He stepped even closer, until the tips of his expensive leather shoes touched the edges of her sensible flats. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gripping her chin. He forced her head up, making her look him in the eye. Penny braced for a blow, a sneer, a joke about her weight. Instead, Lorenzo's thumb brushed lightly over her trembling jawline. He was searching her eyes, looking for the same stupidity and vanity that plagued the rest of the Russo family. But in Penny's wide, terrified eyes, Lorenzo saw something entirely different. He saw a sharp, hyper-aware intelligence. He saw the profound, simmering rage of a woman who had spent her entire life observing her family's crimes from the shadows of her own neglect. Lorenzo dropped his hand and turned back to Carmine. A chilling, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I accept." The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Carmine's cigar slipped from his fingers, tumbling onto the desk. "What?" Carmine choked out, genuinely shocked. "I accept the payment," Lorenzo said smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket. "The debt of $5 million is forgiven. Penelope comes with me tonight." You're taking her?" Carmine stammered, entirely thrown off balance. He had expected a firefight. He had expected Lorenzo to demand Bianca instead. "Get your coat, Penelope," Lorenzo ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "We are leaving." The ride to Lorenzo's sprawling estate in upstate New York was agonizingly silent. Penny was squeezed into the back seat of the armored SUV, painfully aware of the space she was taking up. Lorenzo sat beside her, staring out the tinted window into the darkness, leaving a generous gap between them. Penny's mind raced with horrifying scenarios. Was he taking her to the woods? Was there a shallow grave already dug? Her father had practically told the man to execute her. She stared down at her thick fingers, twisting them together until the knuckles turned white. Her stomach rumbled loudly in the quiet cabin, a humiliating sound that made her want to weep. Stress always made her hungry, a coping mechanism that had built the armor of fat she currently wore. "Vincent," Lorenzo suddenly spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. "Call ahead. Have the kitchen prepare dinner." A full spread. Penny swallowed hard. A full spread. Her father's cruel voice echoed in her head. "Are you going to feed the pig before you slaughter it, Lorenzo?" She closed her eyes, preparing herself for the inevitable humiliation. An hour later, the SUV pulled through towering wrought-iron gates and parked in front of a massive, modern stone mansion. Lorenzo didn't wait for his men to open the doors. He stepped out and waited on the gravel as Penny awkwardly maneuvered her heavy body out of the tall vehicle, her knees aching from the drop. She followed him inside, surrounded by guards. The interior of the house was stark, cold, and meticulously clean. Lorenzo led her straight into a sprawling dining room. True to his word, the massive oak table was laden with food. There were platters of roasted meats, bowls of rich pasta, artisan breads, and decadent desserts. It was a feast fit for a king, or a cruel joke played on a fat girl. Lorenzo sat at the head of the table and gestured to the chair to his right. "Sit." Penny complied, her body sinking into the plush leather chair. She kept her hands firmly in her lap, refusing to look at the food. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of watching her gorge herself before he killed her. Lorenzo plated a reasonable portion of chicken and vegetables for himself and poured a glass of red wine. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and then set his fork down, looking at her untouched plate. "You aren't eating," he noted. "I know what this is," Penny whispered, her voice trembling but surprisingly clear. "I know why you ordered all this. You want to watch the fat girl eat. You want to laugh at me, just like my father did. You want to make a spectacle of me before you put a bullet in my head to settle the debt. So just do it. Shoot me." "I'm not playing your game." Vincent, standing by the doorway, shifted uncomfortably. Lorenzo's expression darkened, but not with anger directed at her. "Do you truly believe I would wipe away a $5 million debt just for the sake of a cheap joke?" Lorenzo asked, his tone dangerously soft. Penny looked up, startled by the serious timbre of his voice. "My father thought you would." "Your father," Lorenzo said, leaning forward, "is an arrogant, short-sighted idiot whose empire is crumbling around him. He looks at you and sees a waste of space because you do not fit into his narrow, pathetic view of what a woman should look like to be useful. He thought he was insulting me. He thought I would kill you, which would absolve his debt and rid him of his embarrassment in one move." Penny's breath hitched. Hearing the brutal truth spoken aloud by a stranger felt like a physical blow, yet strangely validating. "So why didn't you?" Penny challenged, finding a sudden spark of courage. "Why bring me here?" Lorenzo poured a second glass of wine and slid it across the table toward her. "Because, Penelope, I make it a habit to collect the things my enemies discard. A man's discarded trash often holds the keys to his destruction." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I know your father's syndicate is failing. I know he is moving money through offshore accounts to hide it from the commission. And I know that Carmine is practically illiterate when it comes to modern finance. Bianca is too busy spending his money, and his capos are thugs. Which leaves one person in that house who actually understands how the Russo family is staying afloat." Penny's blood ran cold. She stared at Lorenzo, her mouth slightly open. "You," Lorenzo continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "The invisible daughter, the one they lock in the study all day. The one nobody pays attention to because they are too busy mocking her waistline. People talk freely in front of the invisible Penelope. They leave ledgers on desks. They speak passwords aloud." "Tofik." He leaned forward, the predatory aura returning, but this time it felt entirely different. It wasn't a threat. It was a proposition. "You aren't here as a joke, Penelope. And you aren't here to be a mafia wife tending to my home. You are here because I believe you hold the entire financial blueprint of the Russo syndicate in your head. And I want it." Penny sat frozen. For 24 years, her weight had been her prison. It was the reason she was ridiculed, isolated, and ultimately sold off to a monster. But as she looked at Lorenzo Costa, she realized that her fatness had also been her ultimate camouflage. While they laughed at her, she had read every bank statement, memorized every routing number, and uncovered every shell company her father used to siphon funds. She knew exactly where Carmine Russo's lifeblood was hidden. She looked at the feast on the table, then at the glass of wine. Slowly, Penny reached out and took the glass. She took a long, steadying sip. $5 million was a cheap price for me, Mr. Costa," Penny said, her voice dropping the tremble and replacing it with a cold, hard edge. My father has 42 million hidden in 3 shell corporations out of the Cayman Islands. He uses a local shipping front in Queens to launder his street cash. And I know the passcodes to all of it. Lorenzo's lips curved into a genuine, terrifying smile. Eat your dinner, Penelope. Tomorrow we go to work. Over the next 6 weeks, Lorenzo Costa's high-security compound transformed into a war room, and Penelope Russo was its undisputed general. For the first time in her life, Penny's environment adapted to her, rather than forcing her to shrink. Lorenzo had immediately summoned his personal tailor, an austere Italian woman named Madame Rossi, who took Penny's measurements without a single sigh, sneer, or judgmental glance. Within days, Penny's wardrobe of poorly fitted, tent-like dresses was replaced by custom-tailored silk blouses, structured blazers, and wide-leg trousers that draped elegantly over her heavy curves. She didn't lose an ounce of weight, but she moved differently now. Clad in midnight blue and charcoal gray, the sheer mass of her presence became commanding. She was no longer a target. She was a fortress. The financial dismantling of Carmine Russo's empire was a masterpiece of digital violence. Penny sat at the head of a massive glass conference table, surrounded by glowing monitors, as Lorenzo and his top lieutenants watched in awed silence. She bypassed the archaic security of her father's Cayman Island shell companies with terrifying ease. Carmine's entire Queens distribution network is funded through a front called Apex Shipping, Penny explained, her voice steady as her manicured, plump fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. He thinks because the paper trail is physical, it can't be touched. But he pays the dock workers through a centralized payroll software and rerouting their direct deposits into an escrow account registered to a dummy corporation in Panama. Vincent, who had once scoffed at her, leaned over her shoulder, staring at the screen. "You're starving out his foot soldiers." "I'm blinding him," Penny corrected, hitting the enter key. A string of code executed, finalizing the transfer of $3 million. When street soldiers don't get paid, they don't fight. When they don't fight, the territory is undefended. Lorenzo, your men can walk into the Newark shipyards tomorrow night, and Carmine's crew will hand over the keys just to spite him. Lorenzo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of bourbon in his hand, his dark eyes fixed on Penny. The predatory coldness that usually masked his features had been replaced by a simmering, possessive fascination. In the ruthless hierarchy of the syndicate, power was the ultimate aphrodisiac, and Penny wielded it with a cold, calculating brilliance that intoxicated him. The first major twist in Carmine's desperate bid for survival arrived 3 days later in the form of a sleek, silver Mercedes pulling up to Lorenzo's gates. Penny was in the library reviewing a ledger when the double doors swung open. Lorenzo walked in, his jaw set, followed closely by a woman who looked like she had stepped off a Milan runway. It was Bianca. Penny's beautiful, slender younger sister wore a skin-tight, scarlet dress, her blonde hair perfectly blown out, tears shimmering artificially in her wide doe eyes. When Bianca saw Penny sitting behind Lorenzo's massive desk, her meticulously crafted expression of sorrow shattered into a look of sheer repulsion. "What is she doing in here?" Bianca spat, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Penny. "Daddy said you took the pig to settle the debt, Lorenzo. Why is she sitting at your desk?" Penny didn't flinch. She closed the leather-bound ledger and folded her hands over her stomach. "Hello, Bianca. You look desperate. It's not a good color on you." Bianca ignored her, turning her seductive pout entirely on Lorenzo. She stepped into his personal space, placing a delicate hand on his broad chest. "Lorenzo, please. My father is losing his mind. His accounts are frozen. His men are abandoning him. I came here to offer you a real arrangement, a true alliance. Send this thing back to the basement where she belongs. Marry me. Together we can take over what's left of my father's territory. You deserve a wife who can stand proudly by your side at commission dinners, not an embarrassment who takes up 2 chairs. Lorenzo looked down at Bianca's hand on his chest. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed her hand, gripping her wrist with just enough force to make her gasp. He didn't look at Bianca. His eyes locked onto Penny across the room. You misunderstand your position, little girl. Lorenzo's voice was a lethal whisper. You are an ornament, a fragile, depreciating asset. The woman sitting at that desk is a weapon. She has stripped your father of $20 million in less than a month, and she did it without firing a single bullet. Lorenzo released Bianca's wrist and walked over to Penny, standing behind her chair. He rested his large, calloused hands heavily on her broad shoulders. It was a fiercely protective, deeply intimate gesture that sent a jolt of electricity down Penny's spine. Penelope is not an embarrassment, Lorenzo continued, his thumb brushing against the silk of her collar. She is the queen of this syndicate, and you are trespassing. Bianca's face drained of color. She looked from Lorenzo's dark, deadly stare to Penny's cold, triumphant smirk. The reality of the shifting power dynamic finally crashed down upon her. Since you made the trip, Penny said smoothly, picking up a pen, you should know I accessed your personal trust fund this morning. The one held in the Swiss account, it's gone, Bianca. I donated the balance to a charity for eating disorders in your name. You might want to learn how to fly commercial. Your private jet was repossessed an hour ago. Bianca let out a strangled, hysterical sob, turning on her designer heels and fleeing the library. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, leaving a thick, electric silence in their wake. Lorenzo's hands remained on Penny's shoulders. He leaned down, his face mere inches from hers. The scent of sandalwood and danger enveloped her. Did you really give her trust fund to charity? He murmured, his breath warm against her ear. No, Penny whispered, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I bought a controlling stake in the concrete company Carmine uses to pour his foundations. We now own his infrastructure. A low, dark chuckle rumbled in Lorenzo's chest. He turned her chair around so she was facing him. He looked at her flushed, full cheeks, the heavy curve of her thighs, the brilliant, ruthless light in her eyes. He didn't see a flaw. He saw an empire. He cupped her jaw, his thumb tracing the soft flesh of her chin, and crashed his mouth against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a fierce, consuming demand that Penny answered with equal hunger, wrapping her thick arms around his neck, finally stepping into the devastating power she had always been denied. The final collapse of Carmine Russo was neither loud nor explosive. It was a suffocating, systematic strangulation. By the end of the second month, Carmine was a ghost, haunting an empty mansion. His capos had either defected to Lorenzo or been arrested on anonymous tips that contained undeniable, meticulously organized digital evidence. The climax arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening. Lorenzo and Penny were sitting in the estate's grand living room, a fire roaring in the hearth. Penny was draped in a velvet robe, her head resting against Lorenzo's chest as they reviewed a dossier, when the perimeter alarm softly chimed. Vincent walked into the room, his face impassive. Boss, Carmine Russo is at the front gate. He's alone. He's unarmed, and he looks like a drowned rat. Once a parley, Lorenzo glanced down at Penny. She nodded once, her expression hardening into absolute granite. Bring him to the warehouse. Let him smell the rust. An hour later, Penny and Lorenzo stood side by side on a catwalk overlooking Lorenzo's massive, empty shipping warehouse. Below them, standing in a puddle of rainwater leaking from a skylight, was Carmine Russo. The man who had once terrified New York's underworld looked pathetic. His expensive suit hung off his shrinking frame. His face was gaunt, and his hands trembled violently. "Lorenzo!" Carmine shouted, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "You win. You took the money, you took the territory. And done. Call off the dogs. The commission has blacklisted me. Just let me walk away with my life." Lorenzo rested his forearms on the metal railing. "I didn't take your territory, Carmine. I merely supervised the transition." He stepped back, allowing Penny to step fully into the harsh glare of the industrial floodlights. Carmine squinted up at the catwalk. When his eyes recognized the heavy, imposing silhouette of his eldest daughter, his jaw slacked. "Penny? What? What are you doing?" "Lorenzo, I thought you would have gutted that fat pig by now." Penny didn't raise her voice, but in the cavernous silence of the warehouse, her words struck like a whip. "The pig learned how to bite back, father," Carmine sneered, a desperate flicker of his old arrogance flaring up. You think you did this? You're nothing. You're a bloated embarrassment who spent her life hiding in a corner eating cake. You don't have the brains to orchestrate a takeover." "I spent my life in the corner because you put me there," Penny replied, her voice lethally calm. "But corners give you an excellent view of the entire room. I saw you skimming from the Vargas cartel. I saw you bribing Judge Harrison. I saw you funneling syndicate cash to pay off Bianca's gambling debts. And I kept all the receipts." Carmine's face turned an ugly shade of purple. He pointed a trembling, rain-soaked finger up at them. "You think you've won? You think I'd come here without a dead man's switch? You underestimated me, you fat bitch. I made a deal." Lorenzo tensed, his hand dropping to the heavy pistol at his waist, but Penny placed a calming hand on his forearm. "A deal with Special Agent Thomas Gable of the FBI?" Penny asked, tilting her head. Carmine froze, the blood draining completely from his face. How do you know that name?" "Because Agent Gable is a very expensive man to buy," Penny explained, stepping closer to the edge of the railing, her presence dominating the massive space. "You gave him the location of Lorenzo's primary distribution hub. You promised him a career-making bust in exchange for immunity and witness protection for you and Bianca. The raid is happening right now." Carmine screamed, a hysterical, panicked pitch to his voice. "Gable is hitting your hub, Lorenzo. You're going to federal prison, and this freak is going down with you." Penny let out a soft, dark laugh. It was a sound entirely devoid of joy. "Father, you really should have paid more attention to the ledgers. The property for the distribution hub Gable is currently raiding was transferred 3 days ago." "Transferred?" Carmine whispered, his eyes darting frantically. "Yes," Penny smiled, a terrifying carnivorous expression. "I transferred ownership in full back into your name, and I moved 3 tons of uncut narcotics from our storage into that facility this afternoon. Agent Gable isn't raiding Lorenzo Costa. He's raiding Carmine Russo's personal property. And since Gable's bosses are currently watching the raid via helicopter, he won't be able to cover it up to protect you." Carmine stumbled backward, his knees giving out. He splashed down into the dirty rainwater on the warehouse floor, staring up at his daughter as if looking at a demon he had accidentally summoned from hell. "You set me up," Carmine choked out, gasping for air. "You sent the feds to my property. I merely returned the favor," Penny said coldly. "You handed me to a monster, hoping he would tear me apart. But you forgot one crucial detail, father." Lorenzo wrapped his arm around Penny's thick waist, pulling her flush against his side. He looked down at the ruined man on the floor, his eyes blazing with dark triumph. "She is the monster," Lorenzo finished for her. Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the heavy rain. The FBI was coming, but not for the Costa Syndicate. They were coming for the broken king sitting in the mud. Penny turned her back on her father, the heavy velvet of her robe sweeping majestically behind her. She didn't look back as she and Lorenzo walked off the catwalk, leaving the ghost of Carmine Russo to drown in his own ruins.